This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hey there, I am sitting on my deck today, so if you hear a little background noise like birds chirping or, I don't know, weed whacker or chainsaw or something in the distance, well, it's appropriate. I am leaving you this message to let you know that Arya, our fourth member of the roundtable, was a little more vocal than usual when we recorded this week's show. Now, Kathryn does mute her mic whenever she can, but when she speaks, there will be some baby noises in the background. Trust me, it is well worth it. Kathryn brought this topic to the roundtable. She has great, insightful things to say about it, and she gives us all a new pre-writing exercise that I'm pretty excited about. So enjoy this week's episode, Arya included, on using one character to influence another character's arc. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Robert, Kathryn, and I are discussing using your characters as positive or negative influences in your other characters' arcs. All right, Kathryn, you knew this was coming. I'm going to let you expand on that. Tell everyone what that means.
Yeah, so I'm deep in the trenches of pre-writing my novel right now, and so I've been focusing on character arcs, and I kind of have an idea about how I want each character to grow throughout the story, and I have a fairly good set of main characters. Not too many, but there's a fair handful, and each of them have something that they're going to be growing in, and they're interacting with each other. So what I did to kind of try and flesh out that growth was I took each character who interacted with each other character, and I labeled them out and said, how do they influence, say, main protagonist number 1? How does main protagonist number 2? How does main character number 1, etc. influence their character arc? Do they influence them in a positive way, in a negative way? In their interactions, are they helping them to grow, hindering their growth, causing conflict within that growth? And through that, I ended up finding a lot of really great character relationship issues, conflicts, subplots, things like that. And just working my way through every single main character was a really enlightening thing for me to do. So I just thought that was a fun exercise.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Now, when you say main characters, do you mean point of view characters, multiple POVs, or do you mean your POV plus primary supporting characters?
I mean, I have 2 point of view characters and the primary supporting characters underneath them.
Okay.
So anyone in the top 2 portions of the triangle.
Right.
Yes.
Excellent. I just wanted to clarify so people knew if we were talking all POV characters or that mixture of POV and supporting.
I went down to the primary supporting characters because I was finding that if I got into how they were influencing each other, then you got into some of their motivations and goals, and then that was really fleshing out for me the interactions in a much more genuine manner. So it was an interesting, I had to go that deep, for sure.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense, and rock on. That's really cool. I love that you did that you brought your primary supporting characters' arcs into play in all of those relationships.
It struck me because that's sort of the other way round to the way I would do it, and I like the idea that you've taken your focus away from your main character and come back to the supporting characters, thought about their arcs, and then used that to stimulate ideas about how it can enrich your story. Whereas I think I've often come at it the other way around, which is, how can I enrich my story? Maybe I could get somebody to do something.
Right.
Well, I like the idea of, and it kind of relates to our other episodes about characters where we've thought about motivations. And I can see why, when you say, the book was great, the story was good, I really liked the main protagonist, but there are a lot of, two-dimensional supporting characters. And so you're doing kind of two things at once, I think there, Kathryn, as well. When you were talking about it, I was reminded of, and I'm not a painter or an artist, but I can think, you're sketching the main, with a charcoal or something, the main painting, and you bare bones of it, and then fleshing it out and ending up with the shadows and the lighting and all of that sort of thing. And I think that's what gives complexity and depth to what we read. Yeah, it's quite hard to come up with if you're always in the main character's head, which is where I tend to. And I like the fact that you've kind of got into the heads of the others and thought, okay, what do they want? What's their issues? Doesn't necessarily even have to make a play in the text when you write the draft, but it can be a part of how the conflict arises. And we're all familiar with things like the hero's journey or the heroine's journey or the virgin's promise, where we know there are archetypes that present themselves. That's fine, but if the archetype doesn't have an arc, then it just becomes a thing that just sort of pops up. But if you give that archetype an arc as well, then I think that's fantastic. I know it's obvious, and we've probably talked about it before, but I like the way you started with that and used it to prompt you to, enrich in your story.
Yeah, and I think it was really interesting to me to take a primary supporting character who you don't get a point of view of, define what their character arc was, and then define how your point of view character influenced them, because that in turn changes the way that they interact with the point of view character, and it really deepened my understanding of why they would interact with the main point of view character that way, because how they are growing and how the main character is influencing them would deeply influence the way that they interact with the point of view character.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as writers, we so often look at everything from the top down. So you've got your point of view protagonist, and then you could sort of draw lines between your protagonist and all the characters beneath him. And, if you're really thinking, you make those lines two-way roads instead of one-way roads. And, I've always liked to say that your supporting characters, they can still be supporting, as opposed to being antagonistic characters, but they can complicate your protagonist's life. So don't forget about that. But what Kathryn is doing here is connecting not just to the point of view character, but also in between those primary supporting characters. So then you get a whole new level of complexity in those relationships, and that's where our subplots spring from. I know, Kathryn, I know you're muted because you have a baby on your lap, but you want to talk a little more about that?
Yeah,
about what you got out of this process?
Yeah, it's created like a spider web, so instead of, like you said, like drawing straight lines back and forth, it's like created all this interconnectivity, so I can see how, I already had my main plot ideas, right? I know what's happening plot-wise. And so developing that character arc in a spider web, I started to find places where, I see how this character here, you started to find, what I'm saying is I've started to find intersections that I wouldn't necessarily have found where other characters could have come into the plot and really deepened it in a
a good way. Yeah. Did your characters' roles in the story change as a result of finding new intersections and new ways for them to interact? Like maybe a supporting character's role was, relatively minor for the primary level, and then you're like, ooh, now she can do this, or now there's this other facet of the relationship. I would imagine you would also get lots of new plot ideas and depth out of this process.
Yeah, totally. I found characters that were missing or roles that were missing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Things where I was like, I need somebody to embody this to the main character, because they don't have somebody who's being a negative influence in this area or a positive influence in this way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I have definitely done this with one of my supporting characters. And he's kind of the main sidekick to the main character. So, and I've realised that I've got all these other players. You end up often in things like a series where you end up with an ensemble. And so this is an opportunity to flesh them out. But then you, like as a writer, you think, oh God, that's so much work, and especially in first draft mode where you try to get something down, and no, but if I make, no, they just need to be there. They don't need to be doing anything. They just need to be there. And so I like what Kathryn's saying is, it's sometimes reflection is writing, and so reflecting on your supporting characters and thinking through how their arcs are going to intersect is maybe a way to help then when you do get to back into first draft mode, the words come out differently.
Right, and I think too writers fall into that trap you were just touching on, Robert, of not wanting to do all the work of of character development for these supporting characters, and then they end up not being quite as multidimensional as we need them to be, as a result, which I think everybody is guilty of that to varying degrees. But I love how Kathryn's solution is to develop those characters through the lens of their relationships with each other. So you aren't stepping outside of your story world to say, who is this person? What is the person's history and backstory? And doing all the work that you have to do for your point of view. You get to keep them entrenched in those relationships and in that spider web of your story. And then the development work goes hand in hand with that exploration of the relationships, of the connectivity between all of those characters. Kathryn's nodding. She's still got her mic muted. She's agreeing.
I want to say that if you haven't gone back and listened, really, the second I unmute my mic, if you haven't listened to our episode with pre-writing on theme with Mike Stop Continues, that helped me tremendously with starting the character arc process and tying them all into theme. So, and then being able to go back through and hook all that together.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah. So looking at these relationships, not only in that web of your story and the connections between the characters, but also in terms of your theme and what the thematic arc is of the entire story. That's great. Powerful stuff here.
Yeah, and then when you come back to it, and I was talking about the painting analogy, that when you come back to it in your revision mode, then that's when you can apply the deft touches to enrich those nuances of the relationships or the arcs that give it the depth. So I guess, I know I was saying I find it difficult because it's a lot of moving parts to keep in your head when you're first drafting. But as long as you've got, I think, some broad brushstrokes, then that's the helpful part of what I think Kathryn's given as a stimulating concept is keeping that at back of mind or having sketch notes about each of those characters so that the draft can unfold with the proper interactions, but you can go back and tidy those up and insert things and complicate in revision easily. So it's I suppose the opposite is if you don't do that, then you might end up with a story that's very centric to the main character, and we don't get much of a sense. It's almost like they move through a grey world with only them and the villain. And we've all read stories like that.
Yeah, and that connects back to the episode we had on traveling chapters, because you need to use your subplots to flesh out those scenes, where your character is just focused on that one through line, protagonist, antagonist, main plot. What is my goal in this scene? And you need to bring in your subplots. You need to bring in your relationships. You need to bring in your emotional and thematic content to keep those scenes alive. So when you do this work, everything is woven together in a story, so you can't do one thing in isolation of everything else. So by exploring the connectivity between your characters and how they influence each other, and not just how they influence the protagonist, but each other, you're already bulking up all the other areas of your story,
Well said.
What else did you discover in doing this process, Kathryn? So theme, subplot, character development all came out of looking at the way one character's arc influences another. Any other, I mean, that's a lot. Those are great. But anything else?
I did this with my antagonist and my antagonist's cronies as well, as I am dubbing them. And so it was kind of neat to see how my main protagonist would influence the antagonist, and how the antagonist influences the protagonist. Because we talk a lot about them being foils and having like opposite arcs and things like that. So being able to say, okay, thematically, this is what my arcs are doing within the protagonist and the antagonist. Now, how would the interactions between my protagonist and antagonist influence each other's growth patterns? And in this novel, one of my main point of view characters and the main antagonist are half-brothers. So they have a very strong relationship and really strong familial ties, but there's also a lot of resentment there. So it was really interesting to think about how that influence of my main protagonist would like help and also hurt my antagonist in terms of his growth and character arc. So it was fun to kind of deepen that through those relationships and that as well, so that I could kind of feel like he was more of a person because of his relationship with my protagonist. Because I do feel so deeply for my protagonists already, right? Because automatically you love them. They're like little children that you've created. So, but to have that sympathy for my antagonist as well kind of show up as I was writing about, like, this is how he's influenced and how he makes those choices to continue to degenerate rather than to grow and become a better person. You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
I like the idea of having, focusing that idea on supporting villains as well. If you think about some of the sort of masterworks that we often refer to, like the Star Wars and the Harry Potters and, Lord of the Rings, you've never really got just one. You've got the one main antagonist that the hero must defeat, and that within the early chapters of reading the story, usually, if it's well written. But then you've got the other villains in there that can either whisper in the ear of the main guy, the main bad guy, or do something as a subtask of the main guy that then complicates things even further. So I like that idea as well of complicated. You've gone to those lengths of thinking about the antagonist cronies and what their arcs might be.
Right, and they aren't necessarily always negative influences either. Like sometimes you could say that they could actually be influencing them to become a better person, but it backfires in some way, or because of certain other things in the antagonist's character, they won't react to it in a way that actually is positive. So it was an interesting kind of interplay to throw all of them into the mix as well. And since they do all interact, being able to throw them against my protagonist and against some of the other main supporting characters and just see like interactions throughout the story that could really enhance the experience for the reader and for the characters. So.
That is deep stuff, Kathryn.
It's really fun though too. Like I just want to, like, I just sat down with my journal and just started writing, and I probably have about 20 pages. But it was just a lot of fun to think about, would this be positive or negative? Why would it be negative? And and that a lot of the spiderwebbing came so naturally out of those questions that I was asking myself. So it wasn't like I had to sit down for days and days and days and really think about it. It was just the opportunity to explore from a different angle was really helpful for me.
So what was your starting point in this process? Like, say you were doing character Joe. Did you say, what is Joe's arc, or what does Joe want? Like, what was your springboard to get into those connections between Joe and all the other characters?
Right. So I literally wrote a paragraph or two of what I thought the arc was, beginning to end, big overarching arc for the book, each character. And then underneath I would write the next character's name and then just say they have a negative arc influence because, or they have a positive arc influence because, and then I'd give about a paragraph or two of ways in which they had impacted that character's arc in a positive or negative light. And I had a couple characters that did both.
Right.
They influenced them positively at first or negatively at first and then switched to positive. But yeah, so that's how I approached this. And then I just ran through every character that I felt had a strong enough relationship with that character to have an influence on their arc. Not necessarily everyone in the book has an influence on everyone else's arc, but it usually came to about 4 to 5 characters per main character that had a significant impact on their arc, and then I would move on to the next character. So that was the physical process of it.
Yeah, so how much of this journaling was, you know, exploring things you already knew or kind of had a handle on, and how much just led to brand new discoveries?
A lot of it collected and made sense of things I had already brainstormed. I already had a pretty significant handle on who my characters were, the 5 or 6 that I was really interacting with. But I didn't necessarily have their character arcs all down. So it was a lot of new content for the character arcs. I went back and I solidified my theme, and then I was working each character arc based on my solidified controlling idea sticky note on the monitor theme. And,
right.
So that was a lot of kind of new. But then the characters themselves I knew on a pretty good level, and then the subplots and things that were coming out of that was a lot of new for me. I had the main plot and I had my characters, my main players, but a lot of the intricacies that were coming out, the details, the things that are going to make my draft a lot richer, that was a lot of brand new spiraling out of my head.
Yeah. Fantastic. So now this is for a fantasy with a pretty big scope, right? Yeah, and for both of you, do you guys think that this would work for any genre? I mean, if you've got a single POV contemporary fiction novel, maybe your antagonist is more circumstantial or natural, one of those kind of amorphous, like not an individual. It might be an institution, it might be the government, it might be the culture, it might be, you know, nature, whatever. And we did do an episode on that. You know, maybe you're still going to have supporting characters, but I just want to throw that out there. Does this work for every genre? Is it especially helpful for the genres with big casts of characters and really sprawling plots, or what do you think?
Yeah, I would say probably is more helpful for those long series with ensemble casts. And you could imagine that even a short story where, you know, it's involving, you know, a woman who is going through some everyday, an everyday experience. Every story is going to have people interacting with other people. Otherwise, there's not much of a story.
Yeah.
So presumably, we can deepen that by, even if they're only touching against, you know, they go into a pharmacy and they're talking to the chemist or the pharmacist. That person has their own life and their own things, and they're affecting them. So, what kind of influence are they going to have on the protagonist in that interaction? So, I think because when you were talking about it earlier on, Kathryn, I was imagining this sort of the idea that your protagonist is navigating, like sailing through, you know, uncharted territory, and we you know, our influences are like icebergs, and we've only got the tip of them, but you've got these, you know, major bases that could cause potential issues in ways that we don't understand. So I like the idea that you're not necessarily making it big on the page. What you see on the page is the literal tip of the iceberg. And to me that's relevant in any story. It's maybe not as obvious as it would be in an ensemble cast.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And as Kathryn has been describing this process, I've been thinking about my own current work, of course, and I can imagine doing this exercise and not every supporting character having an arc necessarily. And this book is in 4 parts, so there are 4 sets of supporting characters for limited time periods. But I think doing this for asking the question, how does this character influence my protagonist, positive and negative? And maybe instead of saying, what is this character's arc, I could say, what does this character want? Or what is motivating this character? And do the same kind of digging, but just shift my scope of, what I'm doing, of the process, from thinking in terms of book arc to, more specifically, this relationship, but not just to Evelyn, but also to the other supporting characters in that part of the story.
Right.
And then you can come right down to Robert McKee's principles of dialogue, which is that the only reason that we actually speak to one another is because we want something. And so, but this is why, as writers and editors, you look at a piece of text and you go, okay, they've just spent half a page talking about what each other wanted to eat, but it had no bearing on the story. And so those are the sort of, they're irrelevant to us when we're reading, but they might be important to us in real life because it's, maybe you've got to get on with some work, or you've got somewhere to go, and so you need to decide what to eat. But that's not terribly interesting for a story most of the time, unless it's really going to hinge on a plot point. But his thing was that every dialogue interaction, each of those characters that's speaking wants something. And that's the reason they're speaking. And so if you then come down to, well, okay, they want something because it's going to have some form of influence, then that's another angle that you can always take is, well, they're speaking because there's something that they have to get from the other person, or that they have to make the other person do. And even if it's a simple interaction, like as I was saying, at a checkout or something, then that's how I think, I was thinking about this, we were talking about a different topic before we came live, and some of the greater stories that not just memorable for their character, but also because you just loved the words. And I think some of that is down to how the characters interact, even with totally minor nameless characters, like the policeman who stops the main character, who never gets a name, but because they've got something they want as opposed to what the writer wants them to do, I think that's what enriches the story. So, yeah, I think you can definitely lend a deft touch to it everywhere. And come back to McKee's very granular thing of, if they're speaking, they want something.
Yeah, so looking at your supporting characters' arcs, their motivations, and their relationships, but all specifically through the lens of how one character influences the other character's arc, or, if we aren't thinking big arc, role, relationship, right? You can kind of narrow it down to whatever level is appropriate for your genre or your length of story. But I think this is a brilliant exercise, Kathryn. I'm excited to get my journal out and, start building my spider web here. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.